We want to welcome you to the Love First podcast. Thank you for joining us this evening. And if this is your first time and you're wondering what is going on here, our purpose is to catalyze courageous conversations to revolutionize the way we love each other. And we have a special guest this evening that we're so excited to share with you, Dr. Robby Luckett of Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi. He is an associate professor of history, and we are so thankful. And Dr. Luckett, we're so thankful that you're with us, and we're excited to enjoy this conversation with you. If you are returning, I want to say thank you for liking, subscribing, and sharing, because this opportunity to catalyze these conversations, honestly, all it takes is for us to hear something, think about something, see something in a new way, and then that equips us to do a better job in those transformative conversations that we will inevitably find ourselves in.
Love first, I know. Love first, I know. Lord, take control. Lord, take control. Love first in my soul. Love first in my soul. Lord, take control. Lord, take control.
So, I want our listeners to know that at your preference, we're going to call you Robbie instead of Dr. Luckett. But Robbie, thank you for joining us this evening.
Absolutely. Thanks, Don. Thanks for having me. It's good to see you again.
Oh, you too. My wife and I are big fans. The first time we heard you speak, we didn't know what to expect. And we were both speechless in awe. I just want to say this to you. My wife came away and she's like, he is the best speaker I've ever heard. And I was like,
that's a big compliment. Wow. Yeah.
So it was great. But she is so happy that you have joined us as well. So what I thought would be good is for you to take some time and just introduce yourself to our listeners. Let them know. Just tell us about growing up in Mississippi, your educational journey, and how you came to the work that you're doing right now at Jackson State, as well as the other things that you're involved with at Margaret Walker Center in Copa.
Sure. My journey has been a little bit different than most white men of my demographic who grew up in Mississippi. That's for sure. I grew up in the Jackson area and was lucky enough to have parents who came of age in the 60s and in and of the civil rights movement. A mother in particular who found herself in the mid-60s engaged in the movement and would find her footing particularly advocating in the areas of access to adequate health care, especially for mothers and babies, and in the healthcare movement in Mississippi. But she was embedded in all kinds of activist circles. And I had a father who followed her and who himself made a career in public education as a school principal. And I grew up at a small public high school outside of Jackson, Richland High School, but was raised with a consciousness that was unique for white, heterosexual, Christian men in my area. Yeah. And with that, I left for college, knew that I was interested in civil rights and African American history, was actually a political science major at Yale, and had the great opportunity to go to school there, which was a big change for Mississippi, but was formative in many ways. And my earliest research, kind of serious research as a scholar, was around at Yale around the life of Emmett Till and the impact of Emmett Till on particularly his generation of children who are going to grow up to be the activist leaders of the modern movement.
Yes.
And from there, I began trying to figure out what I was actually going to do with my life after I graduated from college, and ended up in a doctoral program in history at the University of Georgia, where I was focused on American history, but specifically the modern civil rights movement. And I do subscribe to the notion that there is a modern civil rights movement in America that is part of a longer civil rights movement, right, that we've always had, that goes back to the 1619, and the first enslaved people arriving on the shores of Jamestown, right?
Yes.
And in my work there at the University of Georgia, I was able to really grow in my thinking and my scholarship. And as I was finishing my PhD, I had the opportunity, surprisingly, to return home and was offered a job at Jackson State University, where I'm now tenured in the history department and teach civil rights and African American history. But the real blessing, honestly, I love being a history professor. I love teaching and reading and writing history. That's what I was trained to do and why I went to grad school. But the real blessing at Jackson State has been my appointment, in addition to being a faculty member, as director of the Margaret Walker Center and now also the COFO Civil Rights Education Center. And find myself embedded in a historically Black college, which is Jackson State. We're 92% African American. But running in the Margaret Walker Center a special collections archive and museum founded by the great writer, novelist, poet, Margaret Walker, when she was on the faculty at Jackson State. She founded us back in 1968. And then the COFO Center, which stands, COFO is an acronym, COFO, the Council of Federated Organizations. It was the uniquely Mississippi civil rights group that coordinated the efforts that would be better known as Freedom Summer in 1964. The brainchild of the great Bob Moses, who's still alive and around and with us today. And COFO, the state headquarters, is now a museum and education center that I also run at Jackson State. And so really kind of unexpectedly, I found myself in the world of public history and engaging community in really rewarding and significant ways. And I've been there now just started my 12th year at Jackson State and at the Margaret Walker Center and at COFO, and I'm lucky that I get to do what I get to do, because being a civil rights historian and doing this work in Mississippi, especially at this moment in this time, has been pretty remarkable. And I get to meet lots of great people like yourself and your wife, and so many others who come to our doors, who come to Mississippi because they want to learn about social justice and civil rights and the movements that took place in Mississippi, and the heroes and sheroes and the courage that was displayed in that work. So my journey is a unique one, it's, like I said, for white men from Mississippi. But I was blessed early on to be raised in a family that valued diversity, that valued social justice, that human rights, basic dignity of all people, and family who fought for that and introduced me to others. And so, interestingly, I think coming back to Jackson State for this job, in many ways, I got the job because of that, because I was not just a white man coming back applying for this job. I had street cred. I had people in the community knew who my parents were and said, "Oh, you're Gene's boy," right? It was an acknowledgement that I had something to contribute and was relatively trusted, I suppose, because of that. And I don't take that for granted. And it's been a real blessing.
You bet. And that's exciting to me. You were if I understand right, you were in New Haven at Yale for about 6 years. Is that right?
That's right.
Was that your undergrad and your master's there?
No, actually, I stayed for 2 years in New Haven and worked as a Yale admissions officer. I covered the southeastern United States. So I spent 2 years trying to figure out what I was going to do, deciding between law school and grad school, and ultimately decided I chose the impoverished route of academia. but I think I'm much happier for it.
Amen. Hey, and then how did you end up at the University of Georgia? We're pretty excited that we're a part of your journey over here. So how did you end up at the University of Georgia?
When I was in undergraduate, one of my main mentors is an incredible historian named Glenda Gilmore. And she wrote a fabulous book called Gender and Jim Crow, and a number of others, and just is a world-renowned scholar. And she encouraged me to begin thinking about graduate programs, and University of Georgia was one of a handful of schools at the top of her list due to the faculty and the scholars who were there. And so I started looking into these programs, and honestly, if you want to study civil rights, if you want to study Southern history, the best programs are in the South. They are University of Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia. Even the University of Mississippi has a great Southern Studies program. And so those were all on my list. And I mean, just to make it plain, the University of Georgia offered me more money than any other place for graduate school. So I made that decision.
And that matters, baby.
As I was choosing poverty, the University of Georgia made it easy. But I had a fabulous experience in Athens. I had great scholars and a great group of a cohort of graduate students around me, and really found my footing there. And spent a good 8 years at the University of Georgia in both the master's and doctoral programs. So
fantastic.
It was a great experience.
So let's pull ourselves down then into the Southeast United States, and specifically, one of the things that you talk about in regard to your home state of Mississippi is that we are a part of the United States as much as we are apart from the United States, right? So I don't think outside of Mississippi people grasp the deep-seated historical relevance of this idea that somehow Mississippi is like an aberration. And we'll get into this a little bit, but tell us what it means for you to emphasize that, hey, Mississippi is part of the 50, it's part of the big picture. Tell us a little bit about that and maybe give us a little context on that.
Well, sure. And as a good historian, let me cite my source on that. That idea is inspired by one of my mentors at the University of Georgia, an incredible historian, Jim Cobb, who Dr. Cobb wrote a fabulous book, probably the best known book about the Mississippi Delta, called The Most Southern Place on Earth, right? Which is now a well-known euphemism for the Delta, the northwest part of Mississippi, where sharecropping in particular would take hold, and where the majority of the population is African American. And his point about the Delta was, he has this great line where it is as much a part of the world as it is a world apart. Wow. And his point in making that is to help us understand that the Delta, that Mississippi is a creation of the capitalist American story, and was produced and built as a part of America, and to serve kind of the interest and the power structure that is and was America. And so, and as you know, when people come to visit, I hope that they leave and will take kind of a critical eye back home to them and say, you know, well, we can look in our own backyard and find some of these stories there as well, right? It's this notion in the scholarship and the historiography of the Southern exceptionalism. And the idea is that somehow the South is different than the rest of America. And if we can blame the South for being the bad part of America, it lets the rest of America off the hook, right? And instead, understanding that the South is not exceptional, that it is a product and is part and parcel. And honestly, if we go back to the founding of the nation, let us understand that our founding fathers, the ones that we point to most readily, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, right? Slaveholders whose power was built upon the institution of slavery. And this nation was built, and the Constitution was created to protect the institution of slavery. And inherently violent, right? Brutal system of power and control, and an economic system, right? And that has simply evolved over time. And so from the very founding of this nation, the South, and when we say the South, we got to be careful about what we mean, particularly white power in the South, was enshrined and protected. And on the backs of particularly African Americans in the South, right? And by the time of the American Civil War, 4 million enslaved people. And that doesn't change very much. And to Cobb's point about the Mississippi Delta, you know, we think about slavery in Mississippi, the institution of slavery in Mississippi, the stronghold was in Southwest Mississippi near Natchez. It wasn't really in the Delta. The Delta only gets settled post-Civil War in the Reconstruction era as federal dollars flood into the South to rebuild the South after the Civil War, and the Mississippi River is dammed. the delta, which had been primarily swampland, is drained and is dried and is made, thus this great alluvian soil, right, is made farmable. Yeah. And that is when the institution of sharecropping and Jim Crow develops in that region and in Mississippi. And so again, a national story, yes, of our place in it. So that's a long answer to that question. But Mississippi is America, and it is a function of how America has always operated, and that hasn't changed to this day.
Yes, and I think that's powerful because one of the things we recognize is nearly every famous civil rights name that with whom we would be familiar with, their paths cross Mississippi civil rights movement. They are embedded in it. You know, just recently, we have lost John Lewis and C.T. Vivian and Emma Sanders, all of whom participated in civil rights movement in Mississippi.
Right.
If I remember right, I think John Lewis, if I remember right, spent 37 days in jail or in prison. Emma Sanders, if I understand right, she is from Mississippi. She passed away in Mississippi. And then just recently, as I was sharing with you earlier, I found out that our mayor of Atlanta, Keisha Lance Bottoms, that her aunt, Ruby Dora Smith Robinson, was also an activist in Jackson, who was also jailed there nearly 100 days. And all of them there participating in this movement, not just to advance people of color, but to somehow overcome the massive resistance to the advancement of people of color.
Absolutely.
Can you walk us through a little bit about how Mississippi, the movement in Mississippi kind of informs the bigger picture of civil rights and the justice that we so deeply crave in this nation?
Yeah, sure. So again, let's understand that there's been a long history of a civil rights movement in this nation, and it's specifically in Mississippi, which is my area of expertise and what I study. And I think what we really should understand, if we back it up, historically speaking, to the end of the American Civil War, let's know that Mississippi had a majority Black population, right? One of two states that was majority African-American, and Mississippi would remain majority African-American until World War II, when the Great Migration is going to shift that. But to this day, percentage-wise, Mississippi is still 37% African-American, the largest percentage of any state in the nation, as diverse as any state in the nation. And that plays a key role in this entire story, because those people, upon emancipation in 1865 with the 13th Amendment, and the one caveat to that being that we can still enslave people as punishment for a crime, which I would argue we still do in this nation, those people immediately begin exploding the mythology around slavery, that somehow being enslaved was the proper place for people of African descent, that the only thing they could aspire to was being slaves. And they began immediately building communities, homes, families, reuniting families that have been torn apart by slavery, building farms, building fraternal organizations, churches, and schools. They write one of the most progressive political documents in American history with the Mississippi Constitution of 1868, that among other things, and I do have a real kind of scholarly interest and personal interest in public history in Mississippi, among other things, it called for free public education for all children between the ages of 5 and 21 and higher grades as soon as possible thereafter, for all children, not a segregated education. Free public education for what we would consider today pre-K through college. And, you think about that as a revolutionary notion, right? In 1868, we're going to educate everybody. And it said, there was a preamble to that clause that said, we're doing this because having an educated citizenry is essential for the health of a republic. Like, how more noble can that be? These people are building a society that had been completely denied to them, right, in a culture. And they are doing these remarkable things. They're running for office, right? We have a Black U.S. congressman John R. Lynch. We have 2 Black United States senators, which Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce. This is the 150th anniversary of the election of Hiram Revels to the United States Senate. Of our Black U.S. senators in American history, Barack Obama, when he was elected to the U.S. Senate, he's the 5th Black U.S. senator in American history. We had 2 from Mississippi before that, right? So this is just setting a little bit of the historical context for this story, understanding that these people were claiming their freedom. You know, we assume that often, and I say we, I'm going to use this kind of we as meaning kind of in the broad American consciousness, that the 13th Amendment emancipated people and that Abraham Lincoln was somehow responsible for that. There were 50,000 Black U.S. colored troops from Mississippi, all of whom were former slaves. 50,000 Black U.S. colored troops fighting. They weren't freed. They were fighting for their own freedom, right, and demanding it.
Yeah.
And these are the people, right, who are in Mississippi who are building this society. There's a number of things that are going to conspire to undermine their power, including essentially the invention of Jim Crow in Mississippi. And Jim Crow has to become, if white people are going to reassert or redeem their power, this era post-Reconstruction is known as the era of redemption. If they're going to do that, if white folks are going to reclaim the power they had known in slavery, they are going to have to institute a totalitarian regime and system of power. And they are able to do that in Mississippi. And they will
this emerge in the late 1870s?
Yeah, it's going to start in the late 1870s. We often point to the Compromise of 1877 as being a turning point. There's a number of things that's going to happen. In particular, Andrew Johnson, actually, when he's president, one of the things Andrew Johnson is going to do after the Civil War, he's going to pardon 13,000 Confederate veterans. This is the Confederate leadership. These are the large plantation owners. These are the people who were on the run because they were guilty of treason and subject to being hanged after the Civil War. He pardons them. And then he forces the Freedmen's Bureau to give them their land back. They had all fled the land, and who had taken up the land? The former enslaved people who had been forced to work it against their wills. All those enslaved people are dispersed. That's going to lead to the rise of the system of sharecropping as an economic system in the South, right? The Mississippi Constitution of 1868, importantly, is going to be thrown out in 1890, and these white redeemers are going to invent in Mississippi the system of disfranchisement that will be well known throughout Jim Crow, right? Poll taxes, literacy tests, residency requirements. In Mississippi, the literacy test was called the Understanding Clause. You had to understand a section of the state constitution to the satisfaction of a voting registrar. All of these things are invented in Mississippi as a means particularly of undermining the 15th Amendment, which had been seen as giving African Americans the right to vote. But the 15th Amendment had, much like the 13th Amendment has a loophole in it, as we can still enslave people as punishment of a crime, so does the 15th Amendment, in the fact that the 15th Amendment doesn't actually give anybody the right to vote. Instead, it says the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. If you can't deny it or abridge it based on race, you can deny or abridge it in other ways, poll taxes, literacy tests, and all of that will be upheld. And all of these things will come together to create this system of Jim Crow power, economic power, political power, social power. We think about segregation and the institution of segregation, right? Separate but equal. Everybody knew separate was not equal and was never going to be equal. There was nothing you could do about it to change the law. You had no political power. And this, it's a foothold in Mississippi where African Americans remain the majority of the population. And to top it all off, you get lynching and the system of lynching, right? And the Equal Justice Initiative, I will always give them credit for the yeoman's work they've done around researching lynchings and recognizing that Mississippi led the nation in the total number of known lynchings. And the word known is the key word here, right? We know that there were hundreds or thousands of people who just disappeared, who we don't know.
Yes.
And the idea that between 1877 and 1950, 654 known lynchings have been identified by the Equal Justice Initiative.
In Mississippi.
In Mississippi alone. That's a known lynching every 6 weeks for 73 years, where we know who was killed, we know who killed them, and we know they got away with it, right?
Yes.
That is a system of total power being imposed on the majority of the population of Mississippi. Seems a weird way to kind of set up this earlier question that you asked about civil rights activism and why so much of it is embedded in Mississippi. But you understand that you had a people, a population in Mississippi, an African-American population that was the majority of the population that really immediately out of enslavement is doing these remarkable things. And what it took to reassert white hegemony over them was a system of terror, a totalitarian regime that controlled all aspects of power and would have total power for the better part of 100 years. And the people who continue to resist that are superheroes. I mean, perhaps my favorite American of all time is Ida B. Wells Barnett, a Mississippian, right? And the work she did. And at the time that she was doing it, it is a miracle that that woman lived to adulthood, the courage that she showed, right? And so there was a history of this activism, and there was a need for people who were willing to risk their lives. And not just their lives, they knew they were risking the lives of their families, right? And so there are examples, there are leaders that others would look to, right? So Ida B. Wells Barnett in Mississippi, Medgar Evers, right? Fannie Lou Hamer. There, and so it builds over a long period of time where you have intense oppression and a system of total white supremacist power, and yet people who are still living there who are resisting that power. They set the examples that John Lewis was looking towards when he comes to Mississippi in 1961 as a freedom rider. Same thing with C.T. Vivian. Emma Sanders as a delegate for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 1964. So many others look to them. So that I think that's why Mississippi is kind of the epicenter of all this, and also maybe why Mississippi is often pointed to as exceptional in this story. But at the same time, all of these impulses, right? The displacement of freed people was due to the President of the United States, Andrew Johnson, pardoning 13,000 Confederate veterans who were all traitors, who were all guilty of treason and subject to being hanged. And so that was a federal action by the President of the United States, who happened to be from Tennessee, right? So Mississippi may have been an epicenter of so much of that for good reason, but it was a reflection of everything else that was going on in America.
And if we think about combining some of these things you've brought out, so you have federal action, you have a way of codifying the resurgence of unequal white power through white supremacy. And a couple of things you've mentioned that I think are just profound is you actually cut this huge part of the population out of the civil process of voting.
That's right. You know, with the Mississippi Constitution of 1890, it was estimated, there's been some good research around this, that roughly 86% of eligible Black voters were registered to vote in 1890 in Mississippi. That would have been Black men over the age of 21, because that's who could vote at the time, men over the age of 21. So roughly 86% voter registration rate. By 1900, 10 years later, it's 4%. And that represents the majority of the population in the state of Mississippi. The significant majority of the population of the state of Mississippi, and would be for the next 50 years. By the time you get to Freedom Summer in 1964, African Americans are a little bit less than half the population, but the voter registration rate is only 6.7%. It's marginally increased since 1890, right?
And when we think about that, I think something that oftentimes we forget as we're looking back into this is, you've got Medgar Evers, you've got James Meredith. Their largest concerns were voting rights. Because of how that was unfolding. I read one statistic that during that time, those that were seeking to register African-American voters in Amite County, out of 5,500 Black citizens, there was maybe one that was registered to vote. or a few that were registered to vote. The question was why? And we forget that there is this violent suppression as well as an illegal legal suppression of voting rights. So this is huge. So something I thought would be helpful would be this. I often hear people trying to navigate the phrase systemic racism.
Sure.
And so people are like, well, is that really a thing? Is systemic racism real? And we hear people say it's not real, so on and so forth. But when you look at the history, when you look at the structures that were put in place, I think we might ask ourselves, what is a system? Answer that question first, and then see if what was going on in order to suppress people of color and disenfranchise them from the economic and judicial processes of the country and of the state of Mississippi and other states, obviously, it would appear from the outside systemic. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And I think as a historian, if we look at these things historically, we see how that system was created. And I would specifically define the system as white supremacy, and very clearly so, all the way back to the beginning of time. And I mean, again, just go back to how the system of slavery is codified and how it's really protected by the United States Constitution, and how the power of white Southerners is protected in the United States Constitution. And the fact that it took an American Civil War to end the institution of slavery. And that if we look at the Mississippi Articles of Secession in this great debate, because I don't really think it's a debate, why I would put air quotes around it, that somehow the Civil War was about something other than slavery. If you go to Mississippi's Articles of Secession, they say very clearly we're seceding from the Union because our interests are inherently tied to the institution of slavery. And they use the term slavery no less than 8, 9, 10 times in the Declaration of Secession, and understand that the system of power of white supremacy, and that other than this one blip, this one brief moment during Reconstruction, where in Mississippi specifically, Black Americans are building something that could have been very different. We could have had a very different system of power. Instead, what gets, thanks to help, again, from the American government, from the federal government, what gets re-implemented is the system of Jim Crow power. Yes. And so, and if we understand, we can trace that all the way to today pretty easily. And, you know, we look at something as easy as simple as not really simple, but the institution of public education and how that history plays out. Well, I mentioned the Constitution of 1868. The Constitution of 1890 changed the education provision in two ways. One, it took out that preamble about having an educated citizenry being essential for the health of the republic. That's gone. So they take that out. So there's clearly no good reason in the Constitution of 1890 to have public education. And the second change they make is that they call for separate schools. They call for a segregated education. They call specifically for schools for white and what they then called colored children, right, in Mississippi. And that system of segregated education, if we look at the history to today, has been pretty sustainable for the last 150 years, and inadequate and unjust. and there's of course a longer story and a longer history here. But if you just follow that trail, you see where that system of power is embedded, and leads us to today to another one of these terms that I think we get caught up in the debates, to trying to understand as white Americans. And I think it's important that we do understand, and that's white privilege, right? What it means. And really, I, for one, don't really ascribe to the notion of white privilege, because I think, as one of my friends and someone that I look up to, a wonderful writer from Mississippi named Kiese Lehman, says in his fabulous memoir, Heavy, it says that white privilege is basically too innocuous of a term, because what white privilege is white supremacy at the heart of it, right? But if we understand that system has been built in very specific ways to advantage some groups over others, and if we're willing to step back individually and say, perhaps some of our anecdotal experiences don't represent a system, because that's always the excuse I think white people want to give as well. I didn't have those advantages. Well, or I don't want to recognize that what advantages I had in some ways were more than what others had, right? And trying to break down that notion of insecurity and the notion that somehow if you say I was advantaged, I'm being attacked. Well, let's really break it down. Let's really look at the system. Let's really look at what people face. What if we really understand and step in the shoes of our Black brothers and sisters and say, what did the Confederate flag mean to them in Mississippi? When they saw it, what did they feel? And can we step back and say, maybe it didn't make us feel that way, but can we understand why they felt a certain way?
Yes.
And then we can kind of attack those notions and begin to slowly wrap our minds around systemic racism, white privilege, and all these things that have been built into American society and into Southern society.
All right. So you brought it up. You brought up the flag. You are born and raised Mississippian. And here a few weeks ago, your legislature voted to permanently retire the Mississippi flag. So how do you feel about that?
Good. A remarkable moment. What an incredible moment of just kind of jubilation and celebration for people who've worked so hard for this. And there's so many people who never got a chance to actually be here for that moment, right? Who worked and fought for these kinds of changes. The Mississippi flag and that Confederate battle emblem actually dates to 1894 when the Mississippi legislature adopted it. It was adopted specifically in this context of Jim Crow and the Mississippi Constitution of 1890. It was an homage to the Old South and the kind of the white supremacist mythology at the time. It had never flown over Mississippi before. It actually is the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. And so, interestingly, when it was adopted by the legislature in 1894, it wasn't put to the people for a vote, right? It wasn't put to the people for a referendum. And of course, the majority of the people at the time were African-American and they couldn't vote anyways. But one of the arguments recently about the legislature not doing it was you should put it to a vote. You should let it be a referendum. Well, it was good enough for the legislature to do it in 1894. I don't know why the legislature didn't have power to change it now.
Yes.
But it really was a unique moment in time that we arrived at in Mississippi that made this happen. And of course, it's the context of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movements. It was pressure, certainly from activists and generation upon generation of pressure of activists that are finally going to force corporations to step up. I think importantly, for those of us in the South, we know the NCAA and the Southeastern Conference to step up and say that athletic championships will not be held in Mississippi anymore. And the Southern Baptist Convention to step up and issue a statement saying this is wrong and it's time for the flag to change. All of these forces coming together at this specific moment. And it was really up in the air until the last minute and the last vote was counted. When you consider, due to the timing in the legislature, was at the very end of the legislative session. Yes. It required the suspension of the rules to be adopted. And the suspension of the rules was really the key vote because that required 2/3 of both houses to agree to take on the vote, which meant that you had to have a veto-proof supermajority in both houses to say we want to take on this flag bill. Yeah. And it was those votes. When those votes happened, that was when people really celebrated, because after that, the legislation itself was a simple majority, and you had the 2/3 majority already in hand. But wow, what a remarkable moment and what a long time coming. And we now currently have the distinction of being the only state in the nation without a flag.
Well, but let's think about some things that you've just shared, and let's unpack them for a few moments here as we let me ask you a quick question. We're going to come to the close of this conversation. Are you good for a second one? Can we?
Absolutely.
Two of them? All right. So let's kind of bring this one to a close. So there's a couple things I want us to think about. You mentioned that there's pressure from businesses, international business doing business in Mississippi, national business doing business in Mississippi, from sports. And man, when you mentioned the SEC, and especially SEC football, and the decision for the SEC to make that decision, and then if we look back at Carolyn Renee DuPont's book, Mississippi Praying, and the role of evangelical religion opposing Black advancement, opposing those things, and upholding white supremacy, for the Southern Baptist Convention to come back around in this moment and take a stand is very important. But that presupposes something. That presupposes that symbols have meaning.
Absolutely.
Can you talk about that? You're a history professor. Can you talk about the role of symbols? And can we tuck in one kind of controversial point here?
Sure.
People often say in their argument against the removal of monuments and so on, that we need those monuments to teach history. But you are a history professor. So I'd like to hear your perspective on the role of symbols, and as we kind of close out, the role of symbols and the role of monuments in some imagination of how we pass on history.
Well, let's just be clear. Monuments into and of themselves don't teach anything, right? It's the people who interpret them. And thus, yes, they do have meaning. And really, their meaning is a function of the people who erect them and who adopt them, right? Let's go to the Mississippi flag of 1894 and that Confederate battle emblem. It was adopted on purpose as a symbol of the white supremacist Jim Crow power structure that was being created. And that was intentional. And you can go look at the debate at the time in the state legislature and look at the remarks being made about its erection and its adoption as the state flag. It's infused with white supremacy.
Yes.
Same thing with statues and monuments. They reflect the values of the people who are erecting them. Yeah. And most of our Confederate monuments throughout the country, not just the South, because there are Confederate memorials, interestingly, all over the nation, yes, are created, most of them in the early 20th century, in the same period of time, right? By people who are trying to bring some kind of glory to this old mythology around what the South stood for. And what they come to represent is this somehow noble dream that had been the American South during the institution of slavery. Yeah. And that is an offensive interpretation of history. It just is. As a historian, that is not what the South was about, what the old South was about. It was about the institution of slavery and white power and white supremacy.
Yes.
And those monuments represented those moments. And monuments and memorials change, and they change over time to reflect the values of the societies that they represent. And there are times when monuments have to come down, and they have to be moved, and they have to be changed. And they do come to represent our values now. Yes. And if you're holding on to those old values, you don't like to see it come down, right? If you're holding on to this mythology, somehow you're offended that it's being changed. I don't hear, one of the big arguments is that, well, why are we destroying these things? And I don't hear anybody arguing that we destroy them. Yeah, let's keep them, and let's talk about the symbols that they are and what the symbols are that they represent. Let's just put them in different places. Let's put some in museums. Let's put them in a cemetery, right? Let's remove them, though. And frankly, it wouldn't hurt my feelings if some of them are destroyed. I actually would be okay with that. Yeah. But let's contextualize them with a history that is intentional about talking about what they were about and teaching about what they're about. And that's what it is important, right? That we have people educated about these meanings and about what they represent and what they represented when they were erected.
See, I think what you've just done, just for me, and I know you've done for our listeners, is unless someone is from Mississippi and really has or a historian that has a deep understanding, I would imagine that many people did not know that new flag came on in 1894 following the reconstituting of the government in 1890.
Right.
But, I would imagine a lot of people are unfamiliar with that history. And then it kind of does this little paradigm shift where it's like, oh, wait a minute. So that flag wasn't always there.
Never in 1894.
I remember reading the book Baptized in Blood. And it was a realization for the first time for me, an awakening of the incredible intentionality of crafting a narrative around these statues, these symbols around the flag, crafting a narrative that was deeply religious centered. And you being a person of faith, I've heard you speak about Mississippi immersed as a state of faith, then it seems to me that it would be appropriate for us to discuss the challenge we face when a person of faith discovers that the values that they've held on to and the symbols they've defended are inconsistent with the faith that they hold. And I think we ought to just leave our listeners there and dive into that one, conversation number 2.
Sounds good.
Robbie, is there anything that you'd kind of like to close us out with this evening?
Well, I would just say it is, in talking about this second conversation to have, we all, especially white Americans, we do have to do some soul searching, and we have to grapple with these things. And let's understand that just because it is our heritage doesn't mean that it has to be something we're proud of. It doesn't mean that it has to be something that we defend all the time. We can't control who the people were who came before us.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have control over that, but we can grapple with these things with some honesty and with some sincere reflection that challenges us.
Amen. That's beautiful. Well, I want to say thank you. We're excited that you're going to join us again next week. And so I want to say to all of you that have joined us this evening, thank you so much. I'd ask you to go online. You can search Dr. Robert Luckett from Jackson State University. He wrote a tremendous op-ed piece that was published in the New York Times earlier this year. And we're going to get into that in next week's set of discussion questions that we didn't get to this week. So thank you for joining us for the Love First podcast this evening. Please remember to like and subscribe and share, and we'll see you next time.
Love first, I know.